They tell you to stay on the marked trails. They print it on pamphlets at park entrances and display it on weathered wooden signs where the wilderness begins. It's a rule, simple and direct. But they never tell you why. They don't tell you that the maps only show the world they want you to see. They don't mention the places where the trails end and something much older begins. Welcome to the Wilderness Protocol, an archive of first-hand accounts and declassified reports from the forgotten corners of the world. These are not ghost stories. They are survival guides for a reality you were never meant to encounter. The file we are opening today comes from a man named David, who inherited a remote cabin from his estranged uncle. He went seeking solitude and a connection to a family he barely knew. What he found instead was a series of childish drawings. And a warning that came too late. This is his story. My story doesn't begin with a dark and stormy night. It begins in the fluorescent, soul-bleaching hum of a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my cubicle, a beige fabric box where I spent 8 hours a day translating the messy, vibrant chaos of human behavior into the sterile certainty of spreadsheets. My world was one of percentages, trend lines, and predictive models. A world of clean, quantifiable data. It was orderly, it was logical, and it was slowly suffocating me. The phone rang, its shrill, digital chirp cutting through the low murmur of keyboard clicks. It was an unknown number, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, another robocall promising to lower my credit card interest rates. But something made me answer. The voice on the other end was dry like old paper. It belonged to a man named Mr. Abernathy, a lawyer from a small town in Washington state I'd never heard of. He spoke with a practiced, dispassionate tone that immediately set my teeth on edge. He was calling, he said, regarding the estate of Mr. Arthur Coleman. The name hung in the air for a moment. Arthur Coleman. My uncle, a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, a ghost who haunted the periphery of family gatherings through his conspicuous absence. I'm sorry to inform you, the lawyer continued, his voice devoid of any actual sorrow, that Mr. Coleman passed away 3 days ago. The coroner has ruled it a heart attack. It appears to have been peaceful. Peaceful. The word felt wrong when associated with that family line. I murmured some kind of pre-programmed condolence, the sort of thing you say when you hear about the death of a distant celebrity. I felt a flicker of something, but it wasn't grief. It was more like the faint tremor of a far-off earthquake, a sign that some foundational plate deep within my life had just shifted. I hadn't seen my Uncle Arthur in 15 years. Not since what my father, a man who builds his world on concrete foundations of logic and reason, clinically referred to as the incident. The incident was a black hole in our family's history, a gravity well of unanswered questions that had pulled our familial constellation apart. It was the day my Aunt Sarah Arthur's sister and my mother Sand, her 7-year-old daughter, my cousin Lily, vanished from that very same cabin Arthur had just died in. Vanished. That was the word everyone used. It was a clean, sterile word, much like the data on my spreadsheets. But it couldn't paper over the horrifying reality. One day they were there, and the next they were not. No note, no signs of a struggle, no ransom demand. The car was still in the driveway. Their bags were still half unpacked in the guest room. They had simply been erased from the world, leaving behind only a question mark so large it shadowed the rest of our lives. My father blamed Arthur. Not publicly, not to the police who conducted a search that grew less frantic and more resigned with each passing day. He blamed him in the strained silences at the dinner table, in the bitter, clipped tone he used whenever my mother would quietly weep. He saw Arthur as a strange, detached man who had lured his sister and her child into the wild, into a place beyond the reach of civilization and common sense. He believed Arthur's negligence, his profound and unsettling comfort with isolation, had somehow paved the way for their disappearance. So we became estranged. Arthur retreated deeper into the woods, a hermit king in a kingdom of pines, and we, in our suburban home, tried to pretend he and the ghosts he lived with never existed. Mr. Coleman's will was quite straightforward. The lawyer droned on, pulling me from my reverie. He had no other living relatives he was in contact with. He has left you, David, the entirety of his estate. I almost laughed. Arthur's estate. I imagined a rusty tackle box and a collection of well-worn flannel shirts. It comprises a modest savings account, Abernathy clarified, his 1998 Ford truck, and the property. A cabin on 40 acres, fully owned, surrounded by the Stillwater National Forest. The cabin. Cold knot formed in my stomach. The place where it all happened. The epicenter of my family's ruin. My father's reaction, when I told him that evening, was exactly what I'd expected. "Sell it," he said, his voice tight, insistent. "Call the lawyer back tomorrow. Tell him to put it on the market. Sell the land, the truck, everything. Tear the cabin down if you have to. No good has ever come from that place, David. It's tainted. Tainted." That was my father's word for things that defied his logical framework. But as I sat in my sterile apartment that night, surrounded by the soulless, minimalist furniture I'd bought because a catalog told me it was efficient, I felt a different pull. The inheritance wasn't a tainted asset. It was a lifeline. A frayed, rusty, dangerous-looking lifeline, but a lifeline nonetheless. It was a sign, a chance to unplug from the hum of the data stream, to breathe air that didn't taste of recycled disappointment. More than that, it was a chance to understand the quiet man my uncle was, and maybe, just maybe, to find some kind of answer to the 15-year-old question that had defined so much of my family's pain. 2 weeks later, I had quit my job, packed a few bags, and was behind the wheel of a plane headed for Seattle. From there, I took a bus to a small town where Mr. Abernathy's office was located above a hardware store. He handed me a thick manila envelope containing the truck keys, the cabin key, and a hand-drawn map. "The GPS won't get you all the way there," he'd said with a thin smile. Arthur was very particular about his privacy. The truck, Arthur's old Ford, smelled of oil, damp earth, and something faintly like pine sap. It started with a reluctant groan, a mechanical beast being roused from a long slumber. The drive began on a paved 2-lane highway, but soon I was following the map's instructions, turning onto a gravel road that kicked up a plume of dust behind me. The gravel road devolved into a dirt track, 2 deep ruts carved through a sea of trees, a path that was slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness it bisected. The trees pressed in on either side, a dense, claustrophobic tapestry of Douglas fir, cedar, and hemlock. The canopy overhead was so thick it cast the road in a perpetual twilight, the sunlight filtering through in shifting, ethereal beams. The air grew cooler, heavier, thick with the scent of damp soil, rotting leaves, and the sharp, clean perfume of pine. It felt like I was driving back in time, leaving the 21st century behind with every complaining churn of the engine. The track, as the map promised, ended abruptly in a small, circular clearing. And there it was, the cabin. It was smaller than I'd pictured it in my mind, and somehow more permanent. It wasn't just sitting on the land. It seemed to have grown out of it. It was built from dark, weathered logs, so old they had turned a silvery gray, the color of storm clouds. The gaps were chinked with dark mortar, and a stoic, moss-flecked stone chimney stood sentry on the western wall, like a tombstone. A simple covered porch ran the length of the front, its wooden planks sagging slightly in the middle, like a long, weary sigh. It wasn't menacing. It wasn't a haunted house from a movie. It was just quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet from the silence of my apartment. This was a heavy, ancient quiet, weighted by the sheer, unblinking presence of the forest that surrounded it on all sides, a green wall that rose up to meet the sky. The silence wasn't empty. It felt profoundly full, packed with the secrets of things that do not speak. For the first time, I felt a tremor of what my father might have meant. This place felt separate from the world. It operated under its own set of rules. The key was heavy in my hand, a piece of old, pitted iron. It turned in the lock with a groan of protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. The door swung inward, releasing a single, captured breath of stale, cool air that smelled of wood smoke, dust, and long-abandoned solitude. The inside was a single large room, with a sleeping loft accessible by a steep ladder-like staircase. A fine gray powder of dust coated every surface, a blanket that softened the hard edges of the furniture and preserved the scene like volcanic ash. A simple, sturdy wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room, waiting for a conversation that would never happen. A pot-bellied, cast-iron wood stove sat cold and silent in the corner, a dark iron heart that had long since stopped beating. Against the far wall, beneath a wide window that looked out into the impassive face of the forest, was a large roll-top desk, its lid closed, hiding my uncle's secrets. It was all Spartan, functional, profoundly masculine. The home of a man who needed very little from the world, and had received even less. I spent the rest of that first day in a flurry of forced domesticity. I opened the windows, beating back the dust with a broom I found on the porch. The fresh air, when it finally flowed through, seemed to struggle against the entrenched stillness of the place. I swept the floors, wiped down the surfaces, trying to replace the scent of disuse with the scent of my own presence. It felt presumptuous. I was an intruder in my own inheritance, a ghost disturbing other ghosts. Every creak of the floorboards under my boots, every gust of wind that rattled the old window panes, felt like a question from the house itself. What are you doing here? Who are you to disturb this quiet grief? As the sun began its slow descent, the character of the light inside the cabin changed. The shadows, which had been short and sharp at midday, now stretched and bled into one another, pooling in the corners of the room like black water. The forest outside lost its individual details, merging into a single, vast, dark entity. A wall of blackness that seemed to press in on the cabin's small bubble of light. It was then, as I was sweeping out the space beneath the loft's ladder, that I found them. My broom knocked against a cheap cardboard box, the kind used for reams of paper. It was tucked away, almost hidden. Curiosity piqued. I knelt down and pulled it into the center of the room, into the weak circle of light cast by the single, bare bulb hanging from a rafter. I lifted the lid. The box was filled with the tools of a child's imagination. Dried-up markers, a rainbow of well-loved crayons worn down to blunt nubs, stacks of colored construction paper, and several spiral-bound sketchbooks. They had to be Lily's. My heart gave a painful lurch. I sat on the floor, the dust motes dancing in the lamplight around me, and I opened the first sketchbook. A wave of profound sadness washed over me. The drawings were exactly what you would expect from a happy, imaginative 7-year-old. The pages were filled with vibrant, chaotic life. Bright, cheerful suns with smiling faces were tucked into the corners of every page. Stick-figure people with wide, simple smiles populated her world. There was a drawing of my Aunt Sarah, her hair a wild, glorious mane of yellow and orange crayon, her arms outstretched. She was holding hands with a much smaller stick figure with brown pigtails, clearly Lily herself. They were standing in front of the cabin, and I was struck by how accurately she had captured its shape, right down to the stone chimney. They were smiling. I smiled, too, a genuine, bittersweet smile that ached in my chest. This was the first real connection I'd ever felt to her, to either of them. Not as victims, not as a tragedy, but as people who had lived and breathed and smiled in this very room. This was a child's view of a world that, for a short time at least, was a place of safety and happiness. I turned the pages gently, reverently. There were drawings of deer with impossibly long legs, of cartoonish-looking black bears with friendly grins, of blue jays with wings like shards of rainbow. It was a visual diary of a little girl's discovery of life in the woods. And then, about halfway through the book, the drawings began to change. The shift was subtle at first. A new character was introduced into her cheerful world. It appeared at the very edge of a drawing of Lily picking a bouquet of wildflowers by the creek. Almost lost in the dense, looping green scribbles of the forest background was a shape. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and colored a murky, indistinct brown that blended in with the tree trunks. It had no discernible features, no eyes, no mouth, no clothes. It was just a long, spindly, silent silhouette. An imaginary friend, I thought immediately. The kind of companion a lonely child in a new, isolated place might invent for herself. A woodland spirit from a storybook. I turned the page. The next drawing was of the cabin at night. The moon was a bright, smudged crescent of yellow crayon. The windows of the cabin glowed with a warm, inviting orange. And there, peeking from behind the thick trunk of the pine tree nearest the porch, was the same figure. This time it was slightly closer, drawn with a little more pressure. I could just make out what looked like long, thin arms, limbs that ended in sharp points rather than hands. A faint, cold prickle of unease traced its way up my neck. I kept turning the pages. Page after page, the figure was there. A silent observer in Lily's brightly colored world. It never did anything threatening. It just watched. From behind a tree. From the dark space of the open barn door. From the crest of a distant hill. A tiny stick against the skyline. But with each successive drawing, it seemed to gain a little more definition. Its limbs looked less like simple lines and more like branches. Gnarled, barren branches, jointed at unnatural angles. I set the first sketchbook aside and reached for the next one in the box. My movements were slower now, more deliberate. My initial feeling of sad nostalgia was being replaced by a creeping sense of dread. The cover of the second sketchbook had a drawing of a smiling cat, but the pages inside held no such cheer. The tone was utterly different. The bright suns were gone. The colors were darker, moodier deep blues, murky browns, angry blacks. The crayon was pressed hard into the paper, with a frantic, almost violent energy that buckled the thin pages. The drawings were all of the forest now. There were no more pictures of the cabin's interior. And there wasn't just one figure anymore. There were more of them. One page showed the tree line at the edge of the clearing. And standing among the trees, almost indistinguishable from them, was a crowd of the tall, silent, branch-limbed things. There must have been a dozen of them. Their blank, featureless oval heads were all turned in the same direction towards the viewer, towards the presumed position of Lily as she drew. They were a silent, watching congregation. A shiver, cold and sharp this time, traced its way down my spine. This wasn't just a child's fantasy anymore. There was a narrative here, a disturbing progression. Something was happening. The air in the cabin suddenly felt heavy, charged. I felt a sudden, oppressive chill that had nothing to do with the evening mountain air. I looked up from the sketchbook and peered out the large window into the deepening twilight. The forest was no longer a collection of trees. It was a solid wall of blackness, an impenetrable curtain drawn around the clearing. And for the first time since my arrival, I felt the distinct, unnerving sensation of being watched. I quickly, almost violently, closed the sketchbook and shoved it back into the box, along with the other. I pushed the box back under the loft stairs with my foot, but the images were burned into my mind. The silent, spindly figures standing at the edge of the woods. It was just a child's overactive imagination, I told myself, my voice of reason sounding small and unconvincing in the vast quiet. A little girl, alone in the woods, processing her new environment, populating it with monsters from her head. But another, more primal part of me, a part that listened to the heavy, breathing silence of the woods, wasn't so sure. That night, I did something I'm sure my uncle rarely did. I walked to the heavy wooden door and slid the thick iron bolt across. The sound of it locking into place was loud and final, a gesture that felt both profoundly necessary and utterly, laughably futile. As I lay in the unfamiliar bed in the loft, wrapped in a dusty but warm wool blanket, I couldn't sleep. I listened to the sounds of the forest, trying to convince myself that the whisper of the wind through the pines was only the wind, that the creak of the cabin settling was only old wood. But every sound was now suspect. Every rustle of leaves was a footstep. Every tap of a branch against the roof was a finger, testing the boundary of my small, fragile sanctuary. The drawings had changed the place for me. They had given a face to the silence. And it was a face I was beginning to fear I would see, if I only looked hard enough. The sun rose the next morning, slicing through the tall pines and casting long, clean stripes of light across the cabin floor. In the crisp, impartial brightness of dawn, my fear felt foolish. The oppressive, watching presence of the night before seemed to have receded with the darkness, like some nocturnal predator slinking back to its lair. The tapping on the window, a loose shutter, I told myself, a branch finally grown long enough to reach the glass. The chilling effect of Lily's drawings? The product of an overcaffeinated mind steeped in a place of tragedy and isolation. My rational mind, the part of me that had built a career on finding logical patterns in chaos, reasserted control. It demanded order. It demanded evidence. I was a data analyst, after all. And what were Lily's drawings, if not a data set? A collection of data points charting the psychological state of a young girl in a new, strange environment. I would not be spooked by shadows. I would treat this as a project. I would analyze the data, form a hypothesis, and reach a logical conclusion. The conclusion, I was certain, would be that I was letting my imagination get the better of me. I pulled the cardboard box out from under the loft stairs again. This time, I didn't just glance through the sketchbooks. I took every single drawing from the spiral-bound books, from the loose stacks of construction paper, and I laid them out. The large wooden table in the center of the room became my workspace. I began to arrange them not by subject, but by what I perceived to be their chronological order, using the subtle shifts in style, color, and subject matter as my guide. As the hours passed, the table was covered, a mosaic of a child's deteriorating world, and my carefully constructed wall of rationality began to crumble, brick by brick. The data was not telling the story I wanted to hear. It was telling Lily's, and it was a story of methodical, encroaching horror. I organized them into 4 distinct phases. Phase 1 I called the halcyon days. These were the earliest drawings, a riot of life and color. The paper was filled with vibrant yellows, sky blues, and Kelly greens. The sun wasn't just a circle. It was a character, beaming with a wide smile and radiating thick, cheerful lines of light. The trees themselves had knotholes that looked like smiling mouths. The forest in these pictures was a magical playground, a Disney-esque world of wonder. There were pictures of Aunt Sarah, always drawn larger than life, a guardian figure with a mane of brilliant yellow hair, her smile a wide, reassuring arc. There was one of her and Lily having a picnic on a red and white checkered blanket, the drawn food comically oversized. There was another of a stick figure I assumed was my Uncle Arthur, identifiable by the ranger hat perched on his circular head, carrying a tiny lily on his shoulders. In all these pictures, the forest was a benevolent host. The animals plump squirrels, deer with soft, curious eyes, cartoonish bears were all friends. It was a visual record of love, safety, and childhood innocence. Perfect baseline. Phase 2 was the arrival. The transition was subtle, marked by the introduction of a single new element. I pinpointed the exact drawing where it began. It was a picture of Lily standing by the creek, her red bucket full of collected stones. The drawing was still bright, still cheerful. But in the background, tucked between two thick pine trunks, was the shape. The first branch man. It was drawn with a light, almost tentative touch, in a single shade of brown crayon. It was featureless, a simple, tall, spindly silhouette. In another drawing from this phase, Lily is on the porch swing, and the figure is a distant shape on a far-off ridge, barely more than a vertical line. My analyst brain tried to kick in. An imaginary friend it supplied. A coping mechanism for a lonely child processing the loss of her father and a move to a new, isolated home. This classic. She's created a guardian for the forest, a spirit of the wood. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I felt a deep unease. The figure was never interacting. It wasn't playing with her. It was always separate, always watching. It was a secret observer in her happy world. Phase 3, the gathering, was where my clinical detachment shattered completely. This was the largest collection of drawings, and the shift in tone was profound and chilling. The vibrant colors of the first phase had vanished, replaced by a palette of muted, gloomy earth tones. The sky in these drawings was often a flat, oppressive gray, or a dark, angry blue. The smiling sun was gone, replaced by a pale, indifferent white circle, or simply nothing at all. The faces of Lily and Sarah, once rendered with happy smiles, were now just blank ovals, or their mouths were simple, neutral, horizontal lines. The forest was no longer a magical playground. It was a dense, threatening cage of vertical lines, drawn with heavy, repetitive strokes. And the branchman was no longer alone. In one drawing after another, more of them appeared. They stood at the edge of the clearing, a silent, watching congregation. They were always in the background, their forms becoming more detailed, more defined. Lily had started using black crayon to crosshatch their brown bodies, giving them a texture that was unmistakably like bark. Their limbs were no longer simple sticks. They were jointed at odd, insect-like angles, ending in clusters of sharp, twig-like fingers. Their heads remained featureless ovals, but in some of the later drawings from this phase, she had added two small, dark dots, suggesting the cold, black eyes of a bird or an insect. I studied a particularly haunting drawing from this set. It depicted Sarah hanging laundry on a line strung between two trees. The wet clothes were rendered in dull blues and grays. Lily had drawn herself sitting on the porch steps, a small, isolated figure. And in the treeline just behind the laundry line stood at least 10 of them. A silent, motionless audience for the most mundane of domestic chores. Their presence transformed the simple act into something deeply sinister. The dread I felt was no longer vague. It was a cold, heavy stone in my stomach. This wasn't a story about an imaginary friend. This was a story about being surrounded. Phase 4 I simply labeled the encroachment. The final sketchbook. Here, the perspective and the rules of the previous drawings were broken. The fear was no longer subtext. It was screaming from the page. The crayon strokes were frantic, gouged into the paper. In the very first drawing of this book, The barrier between the family and the watchers was gone. It was a picture of the cabin's yard, and 3 branch men were standing there, in the open, no longer hiding in the treeline. They were just there, as if they had been invited in. Then came the one that made me physically recoil. It was another drawing of Sarah, this time from behind. She was standing at the edge of the woods, looking in, and standing directly behind her, so close it was almost touching her, was a branch man. Its long, twig-like fingers were extended, inches from her shoulder, as if about to give a reassuring pat or a deadly grasp. There was no way to know which. The final drawing in the book was the most terrifying of all. It was a child's eye view from inside the cabin, looking out the open front door. The doorway framed the night sky, a swirl of black and dark blue. And standing on the porch, their tall, thin silhouettes blocking the view, were 2 branch men. They were looking in. The message was clear. They were at the door. They were coming in. I sat back in the chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. My little data analysis project was complete, and my hypothesis was in ruins. This was not the fantasy of a lonely child. This was a chronicle, a visual testimony. It was a detailed, progressive account of something terrifying slowly and methodically closing in on her family. Lily's drawings were a warning. My quest for order, now fueled by a burgeoning fear, led me to the last unopened container of information in the room. My uncle's roll-top desk. It was a large, handsome piece of oak, but its imposing presence was secondary to the fact that it was locked. The small keyhole winked at me like a mocking eye. I jiggled the handle. Nothing. I felt a surge of frantic impatience. The answers Arthur's side of the story had to be in there. I spent the next half hour engaged in a clumsy, desperate act of breaking and entering. I tried the edge of a credit card. I tried to pick the lock with a paperclip I found in a dusty jar. Finally, fueled by pure frustration, I went to the small stack of firewood by the stove, found the thinnest, sharpest piece of kindling, jammed it into the gap above the lock and heaved. There was a sickening crack of splintering wood, and the lock gave way. The inside of the desk was the polar opposite of the chaos on the table. It was meticulously organized, the world of a man who craved order. There were neat stacks of paid bills, park service manuals with underlined passages, tax documents filed by year. And there, in the central compartment, held together by a thick, brittle rubber band, were 5 leather-bound journals. My uncle's logs. His voice. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the stack. I slid the rubber band off. It snapped and crumbled in my fingers. I opened the first one. Arthur's handwriting was neat, precise, the script of an engineer or a scientist. The early entries were exactly what I'd expect from a park ranger. October 1st. First frost. Heavy this year. Bear activity down on the North Ridge. Repaired the washout on the Aspen Creek Trail. The entries were mundane, factual. I scanned through them, my eyes racing, looking for a name. I found it. October 14th. Sarah and Lily arrived today. The cabin feels loud, full. It's a good feeling. Sarah seems broken, but the quiet here will be good for her. The forest is a good balm for wounds the city can't heal. Lily is a firefly in the woods, a spark of light. She loves it, says the trees whisper stories to her. Poet, that one. I glanced over at my table of drawings. This entry's date corresponded perfectly with Phase 1. The happy times. A cold shiver of confirmation went through me. I kept reading, my heart beating a little faster. I was no longer just reading. I was cross-referencing, matching my uncle's words to his niece's art. I was looking for a specific mention, a specific clue. I found it in an entry dated about a month later. November 22nd. Lily has a new imaginary friend. She calls him the tall man with twiggy arms. Says he lives in the deep woods and watches over the forest. Harmless, I suppose. It's natural for a child in her situation, alone out here, to create a companion. It's a big, lonely world for a little girl. Still, there's a seriousness in her eyes when she talks about him that is unsettling. This was it. The entry coincided perfectly with the beginning of Phase 2 in the drawings. The arrival. My uncle had seen it. He had documented the first data point. The two narratives, the child's art and the man's log, had just locked together. I tore through the journals now, my search becoming more frantic. His entries about Sarah and Lily became more frequent, and his neat, controlled script began to show the first signs of strain, the letters becoming slightly more slanted, more hurried. December 10th. Lily says there are more of them now. The tall men, she calls them. She draws them constantly. It's all she draws anymore. The happy sons are gone. I asked her what they want. She looked at me with those serious eyes and said, "They just want to watch. They're waiting for us to be ready." Ready for what? I asked her. She just shrugged and went back to her drawing. Sarah is worried. She came to me last night, said Lily has been waking up at night, just standing at her window, staring out into the woods. Phase 3. The gathering. The dread I'd felt looking at the drawings was now amplified 100-fold, filtered through the lens of my uncle's growing, rational fear. This was a man of the wilderness, a man who understood its rhythms and its real dangers: bears, blizzards, getting lost. And he was getting scared of a child's drawings. January 5th. I found strange tracks at the edge of the clearing this morning, near the woodpile. Not deer, not bear, not anything I recognize. Long, thin impressions in the soft snow, almost no depth, like someone walking on stilts. They went on for 20 feet and then ended abruptly at the treeline, as if whatever made them had simply vanished into the trees. When I showed them to Sarah, she went pale. Said Lily told her the tall men don't like to leave marks. I spent the afternoon walking the property line with my rifle. I felt like a fool and I felt utterly terrified. The threat was now physical, tangible. My throat went dry. January 19th. It's the silence I can't stand. The woods have gone completely quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It's like they're all holding their breath, waiting. At night, I hear tapping on the roof, like light branches dragging across the shingles. But the nearest tree branch is 50 feet from the house. Sarah has locked all the windows. We never lock the windows. This place is starting to feel like a cage. His words hit me like a physical blow. The tapping, the exact same sound I had rationalized away just this morning. It wasn't a loose shutter. It wasn't the wind. His last few entries were short, almost frantic. His handwriting was a barely legible scrawl, the ink bleeding in places as if his hand was shaking. February 3rd. Lily gave me a drawing today. It's on my desk now. It's a picture of me in my ranger hat, standing by the door. And one of them is standing right behind me. Its long, twiggy hand is on my shoulder. Lily was crying when she gave it to me. She whispered, "He said he likes you. He said you belong here too." A blast of cold air seemed to sweep through the cabin. "He said you belong here too." The phrase echoed in the oppressive silence of the room. The drawings weren't just a child's fantasy. They were a report, a dispatch from a war I hadn't known was being fought, a war this family had lost. The journals stopped there. The last entry was dated February 5th. I remembered the police report summary Mr. Abernathy had given me. Sarah and Lily were officially declared missing on February 9th. There were 4 days of silence. 4 days of unwritten, unimaginable history. I closed the final journal, my hands numb. The cabin no longer felt like a potential home or a place of quiet solitude. Felt like a tomb. It felt like a crime scene where the only evidence was drawn in crayon and the chief witness was a 7-year-old girl who had tried, in the only way she knew how, to show the adults what was happening. She had tried to warn them. Her drawings were a warning from the forest. And as that final, terrible realization settled over me, cementing itself as undeniable fact, I heard it. A sound from outside. Tap, tap, tap. It was against the window pane of the large window behind the desk. A faint, rhythmic, delicate sound. I froze, my blood turning to ice. My body went rigid, every muscle tensed. I told myself it was a branch. It had to be a branch. A twig, blown by the rising wind. But my uncle's words screamed in the forefront of my mind, drowning out all reason. The nearest tree branch is 50 feet from the house. The tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. A little louder this time. A little more deliberate. It was patient. It was insistent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there at the desk. A dead man's words in my hands. A dead girl's nightmares spread out before me. And I listened as something from the forest knocked politely on my window, letting me know, in no uncertain terms, that I was no longer just an observer. I was part of the story now. The human mind is a remarkable survival tool. It possesses an incredible capacity for self-deception, for building firewalls of rationalization against fears that are too vast to comprehend. In the immediate aftermath of the tapping, my mind went into overdrive, furiously working to patch the breach in my reality. I sat frozen at my uncle's desk for what felt like an eternity, my entire being coiled into a single, tight knot of listening. I was waiting for the sound to come again, for the thin pane of glass to spiderweb and break, for a twig-like finger to slide through the opening. But nothing happened. The tapping stopped as suddenly and as inexplicably as it had begun. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was somehow worse. It was a mocking silence, thick with implication. After several long, heart-thumping minutes, I forced my rigid limbs to move. I rose slowly, my chair scraping against the floorboards with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the stillness. I did not go to the window, couldn't. Instead, I retreated to the loft, climbing the ladder with the stiff, clumsy movements of an old man. I did not sleep. I lay on the mattress, staring into the oppressive darkness, my ears straining to decipher every nocturnal creak and groan of the old cabin, attributing each one to a natural cause while a more primal part of my brain screamed that I was a fool. When morning came, it brought with it a fragile reprieve. The sun, a welcome intruder, spilled across the dusty floor, and the world outside was just a forest againa collection of trees, rocks, and dirt, bathed in the crisp, objective light of a new day. My fear from the night before felt distant, theatrical, like the lingering adrenaline from a particularly vivid nightmare. A branch, my logical mind insisted, seizing its opportunity. The wind must have picked up. It was a branch tapping against the glass. Arthur was mistaken about the distance, or a new one had grown. Simple. I clung to that explanation like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. It was plausible. It was sane. I decided to impose a routine, to force normalcy onto the abnormal. I would continue my work. I would understand what happened here, but I would do it from a position of intellectual curiosity, not primal fear. The forest was just a forest. The drawings were just drawings. But the forest had other ideas. It had been awakened to my presence, and it was not content to be ignored. My newfound resolve began to fray almost immediately. As I drank my coffee, I found myself watching the tree-line, unable to look away. My perception had been permanently altered. I was no longer just looking at a landscape. I was scanning for anomalies. The dense latticework of trunks and branches, which had once been a simple, chaotic pattern of nature, was now a puzzle I was constantly trying to solve. My eyes would trace the lines, looking for a silhouette that was too tall, too thin, a shape that stood out by being too still. Pareidolia, they call it. The tendency to see patterns, faces, and figures in random data. My brain, now primed by Lily's drawings, was on overdrive. A cluster of shadows between two ancient cedars would momentarily resolve into a tall, stooped figure. I'd blink, my heart lurching, and it would dissolve back into just shadows. The stark, leafless branches of a dead oak against the gray sky would, for a split second, look like a gnarled, reaching hand. I would turn my head away, a cold sweat on my neck, only to look back and see nothing but a dead tree. It happened a dozen times that day. 100. The forest was a canvas, and my fear was painting the branch men into every corner. I was living in a constant state of gasps and retractions, my nerves stretched taut, my carefully constructed rationality being worn down by 1,000 tiny, unnerving cuts. The world outside the cabin was no longer just nature. It had become an active, breathing entity with a will of its own. Every sound was part of its language, a language I was beginning to dread. The low moan of the wind through the pines was no longer just weather. It was a voice, a long, sorrowful whisper just at the edge of my hearing. The sudden, sharp rustle of leaves in the undergrowth wasn't a squirrel. It was the sound of something large taking a single, careful step. The sharp snap of a twig breaking in the distance would cause me to freeze mid-motion, my body rigid, my ears straining. It was a clear and present threat, a notification that I was not alone. The nights were a descent into a private hell. Sleep offered no escape, only a different kind of torment. My dreams were a chaotic montage of the drawings, come to life. I dreamt I was running through a forest where the trees were all branch men, their limbs reaching for me as I passed. I dreamt of a sky filled with dark, swirling crayon lines, pulling me into a vortex of blackness. I dreamt of the feeling of dry, brittle fingers closing around my arm. I'd wake up abruptly from these nightmares, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, convinced I'd heard a sound from within the cabin itself, a floorboard creaking downstairs when I was in the loft, a faint scraping sound from the attic space above my head, a dry, brittle skittering like a giant insect made of dead leaves and twigs was crawling across the rafters. I would lie there for hours, tangled in my sweat-dampened blanket, straining my ears in the suffocating silence, my senses on a razor's edge, until the first pale, gray hint of dawn would signal a temporary truce. I tried to fight back with logic. I was alone. I was grieving a family I barely knew. I was in a location steeped in tragedy and isolation. I had just absorbed a massive amount of disturbing information. My mind, I told myself, was simply playing tricks on me, projecting the fears from Lily's art and Arthur's journals onto the world around me. This cabin was a psychological echo chamber, a perfect feedback loop of terror, and I was hearing the reverberations of their final, frantic days. I repeated this mantra to myself over and over. I was not going insane. There was a rational explanation for everything. And then, on the morning of the fourth day, the forest decided to end the debate. It provided a piece of hard, undeniable evidence. I woke to a silence that was different. It wasn't the usual quiet of the woods, which is always filled with a low-level hum of life. This was a profound, dead stillness. The usual chatter of the Stellar's jays, the scolding of the squirrels, all of it was gone. A heavy, expectant quiet hung in the air, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. A cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Something was wrong. I forced myself out of bed and down the ladder, I walked to the door, my hand hesitating over the iron bolt. I could feel the wrongness of the day through the thick wood. Taking a deep breath, I slid the bolt back and pulled the door open. I saw it immediately, on the top step of the porch. It was a crow. It was laid out carefully, almost reverently, in the exact center of the step. It was dead, but this was no random death. His body had been arranged. Its glossy, black wings were spread wide, stretched out to their full span and held in place by something I couldn't see, pinned like a butterfly in a display case. Its head was cocked to one side, its black bead of an eye staring sightlessly at the silent trees. And placed in the very center of its chest, stark against the black feathers, was a small, tightly woven spiral of dried, yellow-green pine needles. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. A wave of nausea rolled through my stomach, and the metallic taste of fear filled my mouth. This was not the work of a predator. A hawk or an owl would have torn it apart, eaten it. This was deliberate. This was arranged. This was a message. A calling card. It was a piece of art, dark and ritualistic. An offering. A trophy. I felt an overpowering primal urge to slam the door, to bolt it, to hide and pretend I had never seen it. But a stronger, angrier impulse took over. This was an invasion, a violation of my space. With a choked cry of rage and disgust, I stumbled back into the cabin, grabbed the small fireplace shovel, and went back to the porch. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Without looking too closely, I scooped the dead bird and its obscene little ornament off the step and, with a heave, flung it as far as I could into the undergrowth. I heard it land with a soft thud, but the image was seared into my brain. That spiral, the intricate, perfect coil of pine needles. I knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that I had seen it before. I spent the rest of the day in a frantic, desperate search, my carefully constructed emotional walls now a pile of rubble. I wasn't tidily analyzing data anymore. I was a man possessed, tearing through Lily's drawings, which were still spread across the table. My hands were clumsy, my breath short and ragged. I wasn't just looking for clues. I was looking for confirmation. Confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind, that what I had seen was real. I found it. It was in one of the later drawings from Phase 4, one I had skimmed over before, my attention drawn to the larger, more obvious figures. The drawing was of the cabin. In the foreground, Lily had drawn herself a small, solitary stick figure, and on the porch steps, right where she was standing, was a tiny, almost unnoticeable detail, drawn with a single dark brown crayon line, a small, perfect spiral. In the background of that same drawing, standing in the yard near the woodpile, was a single branch man. It was holding something dark in its long, twig-like hand. A bird. A choked sob escaped my lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. It was real. None of this was in my head. It was all real. The connection clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The drawings weren't just a record of what Lily had seen. They were a script, playbook, a sequence of events, and whatever intelligence resided in these woods was following it. Or perhaps the drawings were simply a reflection of a pattern, a ritual that had played out before and was now, for my benefit, playing out again. That realization changed everything. My fear was no longer a vague, creeping paranoia. It was sharp, specific, and immediate. The forest wasn't just watching me anymore. It was interacting with me. It was leaving me gifts. It was communicating in a language of symbols and death. It was inviting me to participate in its ritual, a game whose rules I didn't understand but whose conclusion I was beginning to dread. I became a prisoner in the cabin. My world shrank to the dusty space within those 4 log walls. I stopped going outside unless it was absolutely critically necessary, and never, ever after dusk. I would stand at the windows for hours, which I now kept locked and bolted even during the day, and just watch. The forest had become a living, breathing antagonist. The trees, I swear, seemed to have moved closer, their branches, skeletal and black against the perpetually gray sky, looking like grasping, hungry fingers. The forest floor, a carpet of dead leaves and deep shadows, seemed to conceal 1,000 hiding places, 1,000 pairs of unseen eyes. My logical mind, my anchor to the world I once knew, was screaming at me. A single, frantic word, repeating over and over. Leave, leave, leave. Pack your bags, get in the truck, and drive until the trees are replaced by streetlights and concrete. Drive until you can't smell the pine and the damp earth anymore. But I couldn't. I was bound to this place. Not by law or by ownership, but by a desperate, obsessive need to understand what had truly happened to Sarah and Lily. Leaving felt like a betrayal, felt like abandoning them all over again, leaving them to this place. I felt, with a certainty that defied all reason and survival instinct, that the answers were still here, that the drawings and the journals, which I now saw as a single, unified text, still held one final secret, one final chapter. And so I stayed. I huddled in the oppressive silence of my cage, a fortress that offered no real protection, and I waited. I waited for the forest to make its next move. I didn't know what I was looking for. I only knew that I had to find it before the final act of the script could play out, before the story in the drawings reached its inevitable, terrifying conclusion. Obsession is a powerful fuel. It burns away reason, caution, and the instinct for self-preservation. My life had shrunk to the four walls of that cabin, and my world had narrowed to a singular, frantic purpose: to find the final piece of the puzzle. I was convinced that Arthur and Lily had left something more, a final message, a key. I began to tear the cabin apart, not with violence, but with a meticulous, desperate energy. I ran my hands over every inch of the log walls, searching for hollow spots. I tapped every floorboard, listening for a change in tone. I emptied every drawer, every cupboard, shaking out old blankets, looking inside dusty boots. I was searching for the unknown, guided only by a gut feeling that there was one last secret to be found. I found it under the sleeping loft, behind a loose stone in the hearth. The stone came away with a gritty scrape, revealing a small, dark cavity. My heart hammered against my ribs. Reaching inside, my fingers brushed against a canvas satchel. It was damp and smelled of earth and ozone. I pulled it out into the dim light of the room. It was heavier than it should have been. With trembling hands, I unbuckled the stiff leather straps. Inside, there wasn't a single object, but a collection of them. First, there was another set of drawings. But these were different. They weren't in a sketchbook. They were drawn on loose sheets of thick, brittle paper, the kind used for watercolor painting. They were Lily's work, but they were unlike anything I had seen before. The childlike quality was gone, replaced by a raw, primal terror. The crayon was pressed so hard it had torn through the paper in places. The colors were dark, muddy, and chaotic. I laid them out on the floor. There were only 5 of them. They were the end of the story. The first drawing showed the cabin, but the door was wide open, a black, gaping maw. From the door, a line of twig-like arms were reaching in, pulling at the stick figures of Sarah and Lily. The branch men weren't outside anymore. They were in the house. The second drawing was a maelstrom of black and brown scribbles, representing the deep forest. In the center, the figures of Sarah and Lily were being led, or dragged, by a crowd of branch men. They were moving towards something. The third drawing clarified what that something was. It was a circle of tall, sharp stones, like giant teeth jutting from the earth. The stones were arranged in a familiar shape, a spiral. In the center of the spiral, the air itself seemed to be twisting, drawn in black crayon as a swirling, chaotic vortex. The fourth drawing was the most disturbing. It depicted a single branch man standing before the figure of Lily. It was holding something out to her, a gift. It was a flower, its petals made from what looked like yellowed bone, its stem a twisted collection of dark twigs. And Lily, her face a blank oval with a single tear track, was reaching for it. The final drawing was just the vortex, a furious swirl of black, sucking everything into a central point of nothingness. And caught in the swirl, becoming part of the chaos, were two small, fading shapes, a woman and a child. I could barely breathe. This was it. This was what happened. It wasn't a kidnapping. It wasn't murder. It was a harvest, a reclamation. I felt a profound, soul-crushing grief for the little girl who had been forced to document her own abduction, her own consumption by a force she couldn't possibly understand. Beneath the drawings in the satchel was one final item, my uncle's last journal. It was smaller than the others, a simple, pocket-sized field log. Its pages were warped and stained with what looked like water, or maybe sweat. His handwriting was nearly unrecognizable, a frantic, jagged scrawl that careened across the page. There was only one long entry. February 9th. They're gone. God help me, they're gone. It happened last night. The storm hit. Wind, snow, a blizzard out of nowhere. The power went out. We were huddled by the fire. Lily was quiet, not sleeping, just watching the fire. Sarah was humming to her, trying to keep her calm. But I could feel it. The whole cabin was vibrating. A low hum, like the whole forest was a tuning fork that had just been struck. And the tapping. It wasn't on the windows anymore. It was everywhere. On the walls, the roof, the door. 100 branches, 100 fingers. Knocking. Wanting in. Lily started to cry. She looked at Sarah and said, "Mommy, they're here. They brought the gift." Sarah just held her tighter. I grabbed the rifle. I was screaming at them, screaming into the storm to leave us alone. And then the door just blew open. Not the wind. It wasn't the wind. It flew off its hinges like it was kicked by a giant. The snow and the wind roared in, and for a second, I couldn't see anything but a swirl of white. And they were there, in the doorway, 3 of them, so tall they had to stoop to get in. They didn't make a sound. They just came in, moving like smoke. I fired the rifle. The sound was deafening in the small room, but it did nothing. The bullets went through them like they were made of shadow and fog. They didn't even flinch. They went for Sarah and Lily. They didn't grab them. They just surrounded them. And Sarah, she didn't scream. She just looked at me, and her eyes, God, her eyes. It wasn't terror. It was resignation, acceptance, as if she'd known this was always how it would end. Lily wasn't crying anymore. She was just watching them, her little hand reaching out. They took them out into the storm. I tried to follow. I ran out onto the porch, but the wind was like a solid wall. I saw them for a moment, crossing the clearing, a procession of shadows leading my family into the woods. And then they were gone. The storm stopped, just like that. The wind died. The snow ceased. Silence. A silence so total and complete that it was louder than the storm had been. I spent the rest of the night searching. I followed their tracks, the same impossible tracks I'd seen before. They led deep into the woods, deeper than I've ever gone. They led to the old stones, the place the old legends call the heart of the wood. I always thought it was just folklore. It's not. The air there is wrong, feels thin and it hums. I saw them. I saw what they were doing. They weren't hurting them. They were unmaking them, drawing them into the pattern of the place. I saw Sarah turn her head, and for a moment, her face was made of bark and moss. I saw Lily smile, and her teeth were small white pebbles. They were being taken into the forest, becoming part of it. I ran. I've never run like that in my life. I am back in the cabin now. I know I cannot save them. They are gone. This place, this forest, it's not evil. Evil is a human concept. This is something older, hungrier. It doesn't hate. It only wants. It wants to add to its collection, to preserve things in its own terrible way. It wanted them, and Lily's drawings, she wasn't just scared. She was showing them the way, showing them that she understood the rules, that she would accept the gift. I am leaving this journal and her final drawings where someone might find them, someone who needs to understand. I will call the police. I will tell them my sister and my niece are missing. I will play the part of the grieving, confused man, but I will not tell them the truth. Who would believe me? To whoever finds this, this is my final warning. This is my uncle's final warning. It is not a curse upon this cabin. It is a description of the land it is built upon. The forest remembers everything that has ever lived and died here. And sometimes it doesn't want to let go. Do not try to be a hero. Do not seek answers. It will see your curiosity as an invitation. It will think you want the gift too. Leave. Let the forest keep its secrets. Let it keep them. My uncle's words hung in the air. A final, desperate plea from beyond the grave. And I finally understood. The drawings, the journals, the strange events, it was all a warning. A clear, desperate, multi-layered warning. A warning I was about to ignore, because knowing the truth wasn't enough. I had to see it. I had to go to the heart of the wood. I had to stand in the place where they were taken. My obsession had completely consumed my fear. I looked at the final, swirling drawing at the ancient stones. I knew I could piece together the location from Arthur's maps and the landmarks in Lily's art. I was going to the source, against every rational thought, against the desperate, pleading final words of my uncle. I prepared to venture into the forest. My decision felt less like a choice and more like a compulsion, an unavoidable conclusion to the story I had been drawn into. I was no longer just an investigator. I was the final character, walking onto the stage for the last act. I spent the next hour preparing, my movements methodical, automatic. I laid out one of Arthur's old topographical maps of the area on the table. Beside it, I placed Lily's drawings, the one showing the creek with the uniquely split boulder, the one of the ridge that looked like a sleeping giant, and the final, terrible one of the stone circle. They were a child's treasure map to a place no one should ever find. I cross-referenced the primitive landmarks with the contour lines on my uncle's map, a strange fusion of childhood nightmare and ranger's practicality. A line here, a circle there. Slowly, a potential route emerged. It was a 5-mile hike, at least, into a section of the forest marked on the map with a simple, ominous blankness. No trails. No designated campsites. Nothing. I packed a small bag. A flashlight, a compass, water, a knife, and the satchel containing the drawings and Arthur's final journal. Part of me felt I needed them as proof, as a shield. Another part of me knew I was bringing them as an offering. I also took my uncle's rifle. Arthur's journal said it was useless, but its cold, heavy weight was a small comfort, a familiar talisman from a world where threats were made of flesh and bone. As I stepped out of the cabin, the forest seemed to watch me with a new intensity. The air was heavy, still, and unnaturally cold. The usual drone of insects was gone. The only sound was the crunch of my own boots on the carpet of pine needles and twigs. The silence was a presence, a weight on my shoulders. I found the split boulder from Lily's drawing by the creek bed, just as she'd rendered it. From there, I took a compass bearing and pushed directly into the untamed woods. The going was tough. The undergrowth was thick, clawing at my clothes, and the ground was a treacherous web of roots and rocks. The canopy above was so dense that it blotted out most of the sun, casting the forest floor in a perpetual, gloomy twilight. An hour in, I felt the change. It wasn't something I saw or heard, but something I felt in my bones. The character of the woods shifted. The trees became older, larger. Gnarled oaks and ancient pines, draped in beards of moss, stood like silent, solemn sentinels. The very air seemed to thin, to grow static, humming with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up. This was a different place, an older place. I felt like I had crossed an invisible boundary, a threshold into another world. I kept glancing at my compass, but the needle was beginning to behave erratically, twitching back and forth as if confused. I had to rely on the landmarks from Lily's drawings now, navigating by instinct and a dead child's artwork. I climbed the ridge that looked like a sleeping giant, my lungs burning, and from the top, I looked down into the valley below. And I saw it. Even from that distance, I could tell it was the place. A small, circular clearing, a perfect wound in the dense fabric of the forest. I couldn't see the stones from here, but I knew with absolute certainty that they were there. I felt them like a gap in the world. My descent into the valley was slow, cautious. The closer I got, the stronger the feeling became. It was a sense of profound and utter antiquity, a feeling of being in the presence of something that had been waiting for millennia. The woods fell completely silent. Not even the wind dared to stir the leaves. I reached the edge of the clearing and stopped, hidden behind the trunk of a massive, gnarled pine. I peered into the open space. It was just as Lily had drawn it. A circle of tall, slender stones, black with age and covered in a phosphorescent moss that gave off a faint, sickly green light. They were not natural formations. They had been carved, shaped, and placed here by hands that had vanished from the world long before the first trees in this forest had been seeds. They leaned inward, like a cage of broken ribs, forming a perfect spiral that drew my eyes to the center. The center of the clearing was bare earth, packed down hard. There was nothing there. No altar, no pit, no vortex. Just empty space. But the air above it, the air was wrong. It shimmered, like heat rising from asphalt, yet it was bitingly cold. It distorted the trees on the other side of the clearing, making them warp and bend as if seen through flawed glass. This was the source, the heart of the wood, the place where the barrier between things was thin. I could feel the hum of it now, a low thrumming that resonated in my chest, in my teeth. I had followed the warnings all the way to their origin. I had brought my grief and my obsession to this terrible, patient place. I gripped the rifle, its stock slick with my sweat. I knew, just as Arthur had, that it was useless. But I couldn't stay hidden. The clearing was pulling me in. It demanded a witness. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I stepped out from behind the tree and walked into the circle of stones. The hum grew louder, and the forest held its breath, waiting to see what I would do. The moment I stepped past the threshold of the outer stones, the world changed. The low hum I'd been feeling escalated into a silent, deafening vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground, the stones, and the very air itself. It wasn't a sound. It was the frequency of the place, and it was shaking me apart from the inside. My vision swam. The clearing, the shimmering air, the moss-covered stones, it all began to blur. And then I saw them. They emerged from the spaces between the trees, stepping out of the shadows as if they were merely a deeper shade of darkness. The branch men. There were dozens of them. They were taller than I could have imagined, their slender forms impossibly high, their heads brushing the lowest limbs of the ancient pines. They were not solid, not entirely. Their bodies shifted and wavered, like columns of smoke or heat haze, their branch-like limbs moving with a slow, deliberate grace that was utterly alien. They arranged themselves around the perimeter of the clearing, forming a second circle. A circle of sentinels. They weren't looking at me with aggression. They were looking at me with a vast, empty, and eternal curiosity. This wasn't a physical confrontation. I understood that now. This was a psychic one. As their collective focus settled on me, the world dissolved, and my mind was flooded. I was seeing, feeling everything. I felt the immense, slow life of the forest, the centuries of growth and decay, the life and death of every plant, every animal, every insect. I felt the weight of time, an ocean of it, pressing down on me. I saw other people who had come to this clearing, native tribes who had left offerings to the spirit of the wood, lost pioneers who had stumbled in and never stumbled out. I saw their memories, their fears, their lives, all absorbed and preserved into the vast, silent consciousness of this place. The forest didn't want to kill you. It wanted to know you. It wanted to add your story, your consciousness, to its endless library. It was the ultimate form of preservation, and the ultimate form of annihilation. And then I saw them, Sarah and Arthur. They were standing near the center of the clearing, by the shimmering air. They were translucent, their forms woven from pale light and memory. They weren't trapped or in pain. They looked peaceful, tranquil, part of the pattern. Sarah turned her head and smiled, a serene, distant smile. Her skin had the texture of smooth river stone, and her hair flowed like moss in a slow current. Lily was there too. She stood before me, no more than a few feet away, her form more solid than the others, as if her youth, her recent arrival, still held some purchase on reality. She looked exactly as she had in her drawings, a simple, innocent figure. She held out her hand, and in it was the gift, the flower made of yellowed bone and twisted twigs. It pulsed with a soft, green light, the same light that coated the stones. She didn't speak with her mouth, but her voice filled my mind, clear as a bell. It was the voice of a child, but it was layered with the ancient, whispering hum of the forest. "You came," she said. "We've been waiting. It's a quiet place. You can rest now. No more data, no more spreadsheets. Just story, just us." She took a step closer, holding out the flower. "It's a gift. It doesn't hurt. You just become. You'll be remembered. The forest will remember you. Forever." Her words were a siren song, promising an end to struggle, to loneliness, to the meaningless noise of the world I knew. For a dizzying second, I wanted it. I wanted to accept the gift. I wanted to lay down the burden of my life and simply be. My hands started to lift, my fingers tingling, wanting to take the terrible, beautiful flower. But then, through the psychic static, I heard another voice. My uncle's. A single, desperate, scrawled line from his journal. "Leave. Let the forest keep its secrets." His warning was the anchor that stopped me from drifting away. This peace was a lie. This tranquility was oblivion. I was not a character in their story to be concluded. I was David, and I wanted my life, my messy, complicated, noisy, meaningless life. I lowered my hand. I took a step back. Lily's smile did not falter, but a sense of immense, cosmic disappointment washed through the clearing. It was not anger. It was the feeling of a collector being denied a rare specimen. "No," I whispered, my own voice sounding thin and foreign in the humming silence. "It's not for me." I took another step back, and another, The figures of Sarah and Lily began to fade, their light dimming, receding back into the shimmering air. The branch men at the edge of the clearing stood motionless, their featureless faces tracking my retreat. They made no move to stop me. The rules of this place, it seemed, were absolute. The gift had to be accepted willingly. I continued to walk backwards, my eyes locked on the center of the clearing, my heart a frantic drum against the silence. I didn't turn my back until my boots touched the soil outside the circle of stones. The moment I crossed the threshold, the humming stopped. The world rushed back in with a gasp. The air was normal again. The sounds of the forced a distant bird call. The rustle of a squirrel returned, shockingly loud. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. I fled through the ancient woods, adrenaline and pure terror propelling me forward. I didn't need the compass or the drawings. I was a panicked animal, guided only by the instinct to get away from that place. I crashed through undergrowth, stumbled over roots, my lungs searing, my legs screaming. The feeling of being watched, of that immense, patient consciousness, followed me all the way. It wasn't chasing me. It was just noting my departure. I don't know how long I ran, but finally, I burst out of the trees and saw it. The cabin, a symbol of terror that now perversely represented safety. Sanctuary. I didn't slow down. I ran inside, slammed the door, and threw the bolt. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. I had faced the source. I had been offered the gift, and I had refused. I knew I couldn't stay, not one more night. My obsession had been satisfied, replaced by a deep, instinctual fear. The forest knew who I was now, and it would wait. It had all the time in the world. I left the cabin within the hour. I took only two things: the canvas satchel containing Lily's drawings and Arthur's journals, and my own car keys. I left the rifle leaning against the wall. I left the cabin door unlocked. I left my uncle's truck in the clearing. I wanted nothing else from that place. As I drove away, down the long dirt track, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't need to. I could feel the presence of the forest at my back, a vast, silent entity watching me go. I drove for 18 hours straight, stopping only for gas, not resting until the dense green of the wilderness had been replaced by the familiar, comforting geometry of the suburbs. It's been 6 months since I fled that cabin. I sold the land, the cabin, everything to a timber company for a pittance, signing the documents without even reading them. I only asked that they not send anyone to survey the property until the sale was final. I don't know if they tore the cabin down. I don't want to know. I returned to my old life, but I am not the same. The world of data and spreadsheets seems thin, fragile, a veneer over something much older and deeper. At night, I have dreams of quiet, moss-covered stones and the offer of a flower made of bone. I wake up with the phantom hum of that place still vibrating in my bones. I couldn't go to the authorities. What would I tell them? My aunt and cousin were assimilated by a sentient, pan-dimensional forest intelligence? They would have locked me in a padded room. So I compiled this account. I scanned every drawing, transcribed every word from Arthur's journals, and wrote down my own testimony. I am sending this to you, to the Wilderness Protocol, because you are the only ones who might understand. This is not a story told for entertainment. It's a warning. My uncle's warning. Lily's warning. Now it is mine. There are places in this world that are not meant for us. Places where the rules are different, where the earth remembers, and where the silence is not empty. If you find yourself in such a place, if you find a trail that isn't on the map, if you hear the forest whisper your name, turn back. Do not be curious. Do not seek answers. Just leave. Because some things once found can never truly be left behind. And some gifts, if you get too close, are impossible to refuse. You have been listening to a report from the Wilderness Protocol. The evidence presented in this file, including the transcribed journals and the collection of drawings, will be archived on our secure server. The wilderness holds secrets we are not equipped to understand. The warnings are there if you know how to listen. Thank you for your time. If you have encountered something unexplainable in the wild places of the world, we encourage you to document your experience. Your story could be someone else's survival guide. Subscribe for more reports and stay on the trail.